We must never forget those who helped establish the United States of America. The story of our beginnings does not start at Jamestown in 1607, but at St. Augustine, Florida in 1565, the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States. It was Spanish, not English, and it reminds us that the roots of America reach deeper into history than we are often told. Spanish Cuba, just across the Florida Straits, always shared a historical bond with the 13 colonies. In 1762, during the 7 Years' War, Britain launched a massive invasion of Havana. After a brutal 2-month siege, Havana fell. The following year, under the Treaty of Paris, Spain regained Cuba, but was forced to surrender Florida to Britain. That humiliation burned deeply, and when the American Revolution began, Spain saw its chance to settle old scores with the empire that had once seized Havana. From the very start, Spain secretly supported the American cause. Beginning in 1776, it helped fund Rodrigo Hortales and Company, the trading firm that shipped muskets, gunpowder and supplies to the struggling colonies. In 1777, Spain's chief minister, the Count of Floridablanca, made Spain's position clear. The fate of the colonies interests us very much, and we shall do for them everything that circumstances permit. Spain's strategy was global, but the Caribbean was at its heart. Spain's main effort there was directed at preventing another British landing in Cuba, remembering the expedition that had once taken Havana. At the same time, Spain aimed to reconquer Florida, which Britain had divided into East and West Florida in 1763, and to resolve ongoing disputes over British logging in Central America. On the mainland, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, led a brilliant series of offensives against British forts along the Mississippi Valley. His troops captured Fort Butte at Manchac, forced the surrender of Baton Rouge and Natchez in 1779, and went on to seize Mobile in 1780. Although a hurricane delayed his plans to take Pensacola, Galvez pressed forward, and in 1781 achieved a decisive victory there. The capture of Pensacola gave Spain full control of West Florida, secured the Gulf Coast, and closed the door on any British offensive up the Mississippi into the American frontier. Spain's role extended even further. In the American Midwest, Virginia's George Rogers Clark relied on both Oliver Pollock, an American merchant, and Galvez himself to supply arms, ammunition, and provisions. Much of it was secretly financed through Spanish funds, sometimes handed over under cover of night by Galvez's private secretary. In the West, Spanish garrisons repelled British and Indian attacks at the Battle of St. Louis in 1780, and a year later a Spanish detachment advanced into present-day Michigan to capture Fort St. Joseph. Britain, for its part, attempted counter-offensives across the Caribbean and Central America. An expedition in 1779 against San Fernando de Omoa failed, and while the British briefly seized Fort San Juan in Nicaragua in 1780, tropical disease destroyed their force and drove them back to Jamaica. Everywhere the British turned, Spain forced them to spend men and resources they could not spare. Then, in 1781, came Spain's greatest contribution. Washington and Rochambeau prepared for the decisive battle at Yorktown, but the Continental Army faced collapse. Soldiers could not be paid, and supplies were running dry. Salvation came from Havana. The Spanish governor, Juan Manuel de Cajigal, organized an emergency campaign, and the women of Havana, merchants' wives, widows, and daughters of society, gave everything they had. Gold, silver, pearls, rings, and necklaces were gathered and shipped north. It was Cuban treasure that financed the siege of Yorktown. It was Cuban sacrifice that paid the men who dug the trenches that ended the war. Meanwhile, Spain was waging a global war against Britain. In Europe, Spanish armies laid siege to Gibraltar in 1779, in what became one of the longest and most ferocious sieges in modern history. Although Britain ultimately held the Rock, the campaign forced London to divert ships and men away from America. Spain also retook the island of Minorca in 1782, a strategic prize in the Mediterranean, depriving Britain of another naval base. Across the ocean, Spain struck at Britain's empire wherever it could. Spanish ships challenged British positions in the Caribbean and threatened Jamaica. In Asia, from the Philippines, Spain targeted British possessions and trade in the Indian Ocean, tying the empire down on yet another front. What began as a rebellion in 13 colonies had become a truly worldwide conflict, and Spain ensured that Britain faced pressure on every shore. From Havana and New Orleans to Gibraltar and Minorca, From Pensacola to Manila, Spain's war with Britain stretched the empire to its breaking point. Every Spanish victory, every Cuban sacrifice, tightened the noose around London's neck, making Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown not only possible, but inevitable. Today, the daughters of the American Revolution honor the descendants of those who fought for independence, but history forgets that the ladies of Havana, who gave their jewels to liberty, belong in that story too. Some Cuban descendants have traced their ancestry and joined the DR, but the truth is larger. Havana's women were the hidden daughters of the revolution, and without them, Yorktown might never have been won. The American Revolution was not won by America alone. It was a global struggle. Spain's diplomacy, Cuba's treasure, and Spanish-Cuban soldiers all came together in October of 1781 when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The world remembers Washington and Lafayette, but we must also remember Carlos III, Bernardo de Galvez, Oliver Pollock, the ladies of Havana, and the Cuban sailors who fought for a freedom they would never enjoy. And yet how tragic is the contrast that followed. After giving so much to America's birth, Cuba would spend the modern era forgotten by freedom-loving nations all around the world. The truth is haunting. Let's now take a look at the Cuba and the Havana that we would have today in 2025 were it not for this horrific tyranny that has maintained a chokehold over the once prosperous nation for more than 67 years. What would Havana look like today? Havana in the 1950s stood at the threshold of becoming one of the greatest global capitals of the 20th century. A city that combined European elegance, American modernity, and Afro-Caribbean creativity in a way unmatched anywhere else in the hemisphere. The architecture already rivaled Barcelona and Paris, with neoclassical palaces in Miramar, Florentine mansions in Country Club, and Art Deco masterpieces along El Prado and El Malecón. Neighborhoods like El Vedado and Cubanacan were filled with residences that recalled Beverly Hills, Palm Beach, or Newport, yet carried a uniquely Cuban sense of proportion and grace. The boulevards and avenues of Havana were compared to the grand promenades of Europe, while its theaters and department stores rivaled those of New York. The jewel of this world was El Encanto, the most glamorous department store in Latin America, where Christian Dior chose to debut his haute couture line in 1950 before presenting it in the United States, recognizing that Cuban women embodied elegance as no other. The Cuban economy was already among the strongest in Latin America. The peso was equal in value to the US dollar, and prosperity was visible everywhere. In 1954, more Cadillacs were sold in Havana than in New York City, a sign of the consumer power of Cuban society. The island's industries were diversified and growing rapidly. Sugar exports and ethanol potential promised global energy leadership long before Brazil, while Bacardi had become an international brand headquartered in Havana. Nickel reserves and refining capacity offered strategic resources, and cattle ranching in central Cuba placed the island in a perfect position to supply beef to the United States just as the hamburger revolution was beginning. Cubana Airlines was one of the most advanced in the hemisphere, a founding member of IATA and among the first to operate jet aircraft. Havana was already a hub for innovation, trade and finance, and Cuban entrepreneurs like Roberto Goizueta, who later became the CEO of Coca-Cola, and the Cuban stepfather of Jeff Bezos, demonstrated the island's culture of innovation. Cuba was not only wealthy, it was uniquely oriented toward the Atlantic West. Unlike other Latin American countries, Cubans did not see themselves primarily as part of Latin America, but as belonging to a cultural space that pointed northward to the United States and Canada, and eastward to Europe. More Americans lived in Cuba in the 1950s than Cubans lived in the United States, and marriages between Cubans and Americans were seen as natural and beloved rather than as something unusual. This was celebrated in popular culture, most famously through I Love Lucy, where Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball reflected a genuine affection between Cuban and American identity. Hollywood repeatedly portrayed this romance with films such as Weekend in Havana, where the island was presented as glamorous, cosmopolitan, and irresistibly modern. Cuba's cultural life was dazzling. Havana had more newspapers and radio stations per capita than almost any city in the world. It also had Latin America's first television station in 1950, followed quickly by color broadcasts and experimental semi-satellite relays of live events from New York. The city's movie theaters were packed, and with Desi Arnaz and Desilu Productions tied directly to Hollywood, Havana was poised to become a second Los Angeles for Spanish-language film and television. Musically, Cuba had already conquered the world. The mambo of Perez Prado, the cha-cha-cha, and the boleros of Benny Moore were international sensations. Afro-Cuban rhythms fused with jazz and popular music, producing a sensuality and sophistication that defined the island's identity. Celia Cruz, a black Cuban woman, had already become the nation's most beloved female star in the 1950s, proving that Afro-Cuban talent was central to the country's cultural power. The racial harmony of Cuban society gave it another unique dimension. Although there were exclusive white-only clubs and black-only clubs, segregation was never institutionalized, and there were no race riots. Cubans of European descent, many descended from Spaniards and especially Canary Islanders, often had dark hair with striking blue or green eyes, giving the population a Mediterranean Northern European look reflected later in stars like Cameron Diaz. Afro-Cubans identified not as a separate underclass, but as Cubans first, comparable to the black populations of Puerto Rico or St. Croix. They were highly educated, culturally influential, and central to the nation's identity. The funeral of Celia Cruz decades later in Miami revealed the unity of Cubans of every shade, as exiles of all backgrounds gathered to honor her as a symbol of their shared heritage. By the late 1950s, Havana was being compared to Monaco. The richest people in the world kept homes and mansions there, just as they do in Miami today. The Havana carnivals rivaled those of Rio de Janeiro and New Orleans, showcasing Afro-Cuban dance and music on a grand scale. Women were emancipated and visible in every sector of society, from the arts to academia. The island was a magnet for immigrants, with Italians, Spaniards, Jews escaping World War II, and Americans seeking fortune in what was rightly called the Mediterranean Riviera of the New World. Had this trajectory continued, Havana by 2025 would have been a global city, wealthier per capita than Spain or Italy, with preserved palaces alongside modern skyscrapers, Dior fashion shows at El Encanto, Bacardi as a global leader, Cubana Airlines as a Caribbean aviation hub, and a thriving film and television industry linked to Hollywood and New York. Its embassies would have had waiting lists of Europeans eager to immigrate, its music would have remained the soundtrack of the world, and its people would have been admired for their beauty, charisma, and cultural brilliance. Havana would have been not merely another Miami, but far more, a Barcelona-New York hybrid, a global capital of elegance, prosperity, and rhythm, the true crown jewel of the Americas, only 90 miles from Florida. Reflections of what Havana and the Republic of Cuba in 2025 would look like can be seen in Miami, Madrid, and Barcelona. Havana was a city loaded with magnificent architecture and taste and elegance, along with entrepreneurship would have given it an amazing mix of old world, elegance, and customs with new world. Advances other cities in Cuba would likely have been the Ibizas and the Mykonos of the New World. We really hope you have enjoyed this video. We ask you to please share it with everybody you know, and please do not forget to hit that like and subscribe button.